there, and welcome back to another Kidlit chat. I'm your host, Brooke Van Sickle, as always, and I have the wonderful Gavriel Savit here. How are you doing today, Gavriel?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Just wonderful. Thanks so much for doing this. I'm so excited to chat with you.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So for those who are watching who've never heard of you before, have never read your books, let us know who you are and what you do, what kind of books you write.
My name is Gavriel Savit. I have 3 books out. They are here in various different formats and editions. The first one is Anna and the Swallow Man. That was a New York Times bestseller. The Way Back was my second book, and that was a National Book Award finalist. And Come See the Fair just came out a couple weeks ago. So that's mainly what I'm talking about these days, but I'm always happy to talk about everything. My books are weird. They're more sort of folktale-y than novel-y, really. I think that's sort of the aesthetic corner that I'm most interested in, the sort of immersive plot-based rather than psychological kind of thing. They all feature various degrees of supernatural activity in one way or another. And they are all 3 of them set in history. And, you know, if you're lucky enough to get to book 3, you start noticing patterns in what you're interested in. And, you know, that's a great privilege. And also, I feel like I need to spend a little bit of extra time with my therapist, like trying to unpick the patterns in my writing.
It's such a cool spot, though. Like, it's historical. How far back do you? Because I know this one that we're gonna be chatting about is more recent. I would say, like, it's been 100 years, right?
Yeah, the Come See the Fair is based around the 1893 Chicago World's Fair.
Yeah.
The Way Back is a little bit less pinned down. It starts in 1812, but most of the action takes place substantially after that. And then Anna and the Swallow Man takes place during the Second World War. So it's all relatively recent.
There's a huge gap there. I love it. That's so awesome. And so your first couple of books were YA novels, and they're huge, like New York Times bestseller, National Book Final. That's awesome.
Yeah, I'm very lucky.
Let's chat about that.
It's amazing. It's always wonderful and very, very flattering. And I mentioned just a second ago before we got going, I sort of fell backwards into writing. It wasn't my active plan. So I was just very overwhelmed and deeply flattered and grateful for all the recognition and kindness that people have heaped upon me. You know, it's ultimately, it can be distracting. The ultimate goal has to just be sharing stories and sharing human experience. So one tries not to think too much about critical reaction or any reaction really other than the individual reader's experience when they're holding the book.
Yeah, I think that's actually really good advice, because so many people get obsessed with getting published and like getting the agent and getting the next step, and they haven't really written their book. And like, we're super about, right, the awesome story, and then the rest will come. And that's so true. Like, don't get distracted by all that.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the issue is, you know, so many of us who spend time working on creation and art, if we indulge ourselves in such a term, are drawn to do that sort of thing because we feel like we want to prove that we're good enough at it. And that's normal and actually probably really great because it motivates you. And also, it's important to remember that, like, there is no recognition that's great enough it's going to scratch that itch. So at a certain point, you have to start concentrating on, okay, what do I actually want to accomplish by writing this story down? What do I want to pass on to individual readers and their individual experience? Because that's really all there is. The rest is just noise. Sometimes very lovely noise, but noise.
I love it. I love that. That's we should write these down as quotes. So, okay, so your new one is a middle grade. What made you do the swap? And do you think it's like a similar reader? Because obviously the age difference is going to be different. But...
So here's my dirty little secret. I do not write to audience at all. I think about the story. I think about what the story needs, and then I subject the wonderful publishers to the marketing considerations. Yeah, you know, Come See the Fair in a lot of ways, I think really has to be middle grade because it's about certain initial experiences.
She's 12, right?
Yeah, I think it's again a little bit underdetermined. I love to be underdetermined in my writing, but yeah, somewhere like between like 12, 13 kind of situation.
Yeah.
And you know, those age categories are hard to pin down in historical fiction because what 12 means now is not what 12 meant in the 1890s. And whether how much that matters and in what direction is open for discussion, right? Like ultimately, people are reading this in the 21st century. So when they
Yeah.
read 12, they have a certain idea. But in general, I think this book, Come See the Fair, really is about a certain kind of hope and a certain kind of disappointment that happens early on in people's lives. And I'm the kind of writer that really wants to make absolutely everything about a story signify. So down to the sort of generic categorization of like, you know, what kind of children's writing is this? As I say, you know, I'm not concentrating super hard on you know, age range or frankly generic distinction while I'm writing because I think those are largely marketing tools.
Right.
Each book is individual and each reader is individual and they can be helpful and you know, shelving things properly and helping booksellers to understand you know where they might point things, but generally you know I think the story has to dictate what the story is, and
Yeah.
it's my job not to get in the way of that.
I love it. I think it's really good advice too, because you just really want to tell an awesome story and then figure it out later. But eventually you would. So with your first one, let's chat about that for a second. Because off of that branch, did you have to pitch this to go cold, like to get an agent, or kind of how did you get in with the publishers?
So my first novel, On the Swallow Man, I had a completed manuscript of, and I went out to query agents with it, like totally cold, and I was very, very lucky to get hooked up with my agent. And actually, speaking of readership age,
Yeah.
there was an open question as to whether that book was going to be published on the young adult side or the adult side. I seem to have this problem in a continuing way, largely, I think, probably because I don't worry too much about these things early on. So yeah, no, I queried. I was lucky to land a great agent essentially out of the slush pile, which I do not take for granted. It's a tremendous stroke of luck. And then the book was bought by my wonderful editor, and I've been working with her ever since. All three books with the same agent, the same editor.
Yeah. Yeah. So did you pitch it as a YA, or did the editor kind of help you decide where would be best to?
This third book,
The first one, and
the first one, that one, when it was bought by Young Readers imprint, that was like, okay, so this is the direction that we're going on it. And there was a tiny little bit of touch up here and there to sort
to
of
make it probably
highlight.
more YA. Yeah.
Yeah, but really not very much. Like I think half
Yeah.
a scene basically. But that's a book that's very much about sort of, well, it's about uncertainty, and that plays very well into the sort of dual adult child perspective that happens in the book.
Yeah.
But from there, I mean, both the second and the third book were both sold on proposal, which is exigent and not necessarily, I think, the best thing for writing a story. You know, you necessarily have to commit yourself to things early on, and I'm of the opinion that everything needs to be negotiable until you know precisely what you're dealing with. Now, that being said, one of my sort of great inviolable commandments, which I take from Neil Gaiman, is you have to finish things to know what you're doing, right? So yes, things need to be negotiable, but you have to finish a draft to know what you needed to negotiate, essentially. So yeah, no, I was lucky to be able to sell those second and third books on proposal. And I'm now sort of in a situation where I'm thinking about whether or not I want to go back to trying to write full manuscripts, just because, you know, there's always a degree of compromise in describing a project that hasn't been drafted to someone else. It's always not quite right. And then people get ideas that are not quite right, and then you feel like you have to pitch to those ideas.
Yeah.
It just locks things down that I sometimes think might be a little bit better, looser. But again, you know, certainly from a from like a financial perspective, sometimes you need to sell something if you're lucky enough to be able to do that.
Right.
So yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's really smart because I mean, they always say like the first draft is the author telling themselves the story, and then like you're like, oh no, this is really what my character is trying to do.
Right,
And
right.
yeah, yeah. So, what gave you the idea for your new book, Come See the Fair?
So my sort of theory on where ideas come from is that they're always an agglomeration of lots of different crazy pieces that sort of get stuck in your head, and then one day you sneeze and there's an idea.
Yeah,
So there were a few different pieces to this. I wrote the book while I was living in Central Illinois, in a nice house from the 1890s, which is just about when the book takes place. I think the house was built just a couple years before the Chicago World's Fair, which is at the center of Come See the Fair. So that sort of historical moment was sort of haunting me everywhere, while I was thinking about the book, sort of suggesting itself out of the woodwork every day. There was also a big part of this book has to do with spiritualism, seances, and mediums, which is a very, very fascinating part of American cultural history that weirdly is not talked about very much. I was at a school visit the other day
yeah,
trying to describe what spiritualism is, and the kids were like, wait, what happened? So basically, this was a large scale fraud perpetrated originally by two young girls from upstate New York who represented that they could communicate with the spirits of the dead. It turned out that the knocking noises that were supposed to be the messages coming back from the other side was one of the two sisters cracking her knuckle joints of her toes. And they came clean like decades later, and it was wild because in the interim this had swept not just the United States, it's like gone international. There have been
yeah,
spiritualist societies in Britain. There still are some spiritualist churches, I think, in Brazil. There have been seances in the White House, like a huge cultural phenomenon. And what happened to me was that I went to a fundraiser for a local cultural institution, and they thought it would be fun to stage a seance for this fundraiser.
yeah,
It was incredible because the medium was not particularly good. like it was pretty transparent what the like little average tricks were. And yet it was deeply compelling. Like you could see how everything was working, like how he was orchestrating things to line up. And still, like you were very much leaning forward, like, how's this going to work? Is it going to pan out? And so that sort of started me thinking on a train line that's been sort of running up and down in my brain for a long time about what we call true and what we call not true, and how often we dismiss things that don't primarily sit in like a rational center
mhm,
as unimportant or ineffective, when practically speaking, if we look at our experience, like things that we can dismiss as irrational drive most of our lives. So I'm very interested in the ways that things are and are not true at the same time. So spiritualism and seances sort of kick that off in the book, and it gets carried into the larger realm of fantasy surrounding the World's Fair, and it also sort of starts to trickle into questions about the United States of America and how we run this country and how we think about this country and what's possible and what's impossible, what's real and what's not real. And it turns into a nice big fictional adventurous mess, which is what I like to write.
yeah. Dang, there sounds like so many like really good talking points, Nico. Like it could be heavy, it could be not. Like, yeah. I mean, how are your school visits? Do they get into like some deep combos? Some of those kids, I feel like would.
Yeah, I really love school visits. I unfortunately oftentimes they end up being like assembly style things when all I really want to do is just talk to the kids. Like there's so much stuff that I'm excited to share and so much that I want to hear from them. Like these sorts of conversations are the next best thing to being able to polish up a nice piece of writing and hand it to a kid who needs it.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, I love it. So it's kind of like a heavier topic, like if you're dealing with death and things. How do you
Mhm.
do that for a younger audience? I mean, you don't think about your audience ahead of time, so do you have to prep it?
Well, I mean, I think part of it is that well, certainly I write young characters from my
Hmm.
inner child, right? Like I
Yeah,
try and access that sort of consciousness hidden deep inside my internal defense mechanisms. And I think the real difference about it, like, okay, so I'll take a step back. Yeah, The Way Back is a book about death. On the Swallow Man is a book that takes place during the Second World War, and it's about essentially surviving on the run. And Come See the Fair is a book that is in many ways about cycles of abuse. And all of these are very, very heavy topics.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, they're topics that kids need to have stuff to read about because kids experience death and they experience threatening uncertainty and they experience abuse.
Yeah.
And hiding adult level, nuanced, complicated thought about those things from kids does no one any favors. It doesn't make those things go away, just makes the kids not have access to those sorts of nuances. So I think the real difference, another piece of the puzzle here that I should say is that I have not ever encountered a kid who's been traumatized by something that they've read. I don't think it happens. And that's an important thing to say, particularly in the current political environment. I don't want to get too political, but like books don't traumatize kids.
No.
If kids aren't ready for subject material in books, it skates right past their attention. They just don't pick it up. And in fact, I have specific memories of that precise thing happening. I'll go back to a book that I read when I was young and I'll be like, oh, I didn't realize this was in here at all. You just
Yeah.
don't assimilate it.
Same thing with like musical lyrics. Like you sing a song, you have no idea what's happening.
Exactly. You know the sounds, you don't know the meaning at all. Precisely. So I think that's really important because often I think when people think about children's books that deal with darker subjects, they're like, well, isn't this going to upset or mess up kids? Listen, kids may be upset by reading dark material, but if they're upset by reading dark material, it's because they're already thinking and worrying about it. And it gives them a way to think and talk about it, which is on the whole, great. So that's kind of the lead up to all of this. I think the only real difference between writing about dark material for adults and writing about dark material for children is that for children, it's an initial experience. For young characters, at least, often in these sorts of narratives, it's the character's first experience of this kind of grief, this kind of negative life trajectory or event. And there's a certain idiosyncratic and personal keenness to the experience when it's the first time that it happens. That's why adolescence is so vibrant a time in everyone's life, right? It's all new, it's all incredibly keen. And so I think that's really the only difference, right? When you're writing about grief from an adult perspective, oftentimes what you're really writing about is self-defense, right? The way that adults push grief off. And for the most part, kids don't have those self-defenses. It's like the real grief, right? Like the boredom of grief and the sort of bone-gnawing ache of grief. Those are things that as we get older, we learn how to distract ourselves from, how to push away. And that makes for compelling reading in a very different direction. But certainly for an author like me, who's interested in folkloric sort of stuff, which by its nature pushes towards vibrancy and extremity, the match of young characters and new difficult experiences is potent.
Yeah. And I also think too that people forget that like kids are people, they're humans. Yes, they're younger. Yes, they're
Absolutely.
small. You should be honest. You should be open. And the whole point
Yeah,
of reading is to like enjoy other experiences, good or bad, and to invoke thought.
that's
Critical.
right. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's really great. Awesome stuff. So let's see. I'm looking at all my questions to make sure we chatted about all the things. Because yeah, I like to go off. Oh, but I know what I want to chat about because folklore, magic, all of that takes a lot of world building. So how does that work for you? I mean, we do have realistic worlds, so some of it's done, but adding
Yeah. So I really love the combination of history and fantasy. I love finding the magic that is sort of inherent in a particular moment and cultural setting. I this is a big sort of debate amongst fantasy lovers and fantasy writers. People refer to systems of hard magic and soft magic, which I think all these terms are a little bit of a compromise, whatever. But I am very much a partisan against hard magic systems. These are, not to name any particular names, but the sort of system in which you say the same magic words, you perform the same action, the same result occurs every time. And that to me is technology, and that's fine. But if I'm looking to write about magic, what interests me is that bizarre, deeply personal, subjective experience of the universe conspiring to create deep meaning in one moment that only I witness. You know what I mean? That's what I understand as magic. And the cool thing about that is that it shifts, like the markers shift dependent on culture. So the world building is really a process of matching my own idiosyncratic experience of magic or transcendence or whatever it is with the research. And in the case of the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, very well set up, because I believe that it is the single event in the history of the state of Illinois that has been written about most. Basically, everything about that fair has been documented. And that's a really, really cool asset to have when you're sitting down to write, because I was able to literally like track my character's movements through the campus of the fair, because it's all very clearly set out. One of the things that I'm really proud about with this book is that it is both very true and very not true, which is to say that every location in Chicago that is made reference to is a real location. Every exhibit at the fair was really at the fair. So it is like pretty strongly back upable history that just so happens to also be about magic.
Yeah. How much time did you spend researching?
So there's two levels of research for me, really, that are necessary in writing a book. The first is the deep background, right? The sort of, where are the like socio-political pieces on the chessboard in the world at this time? Like, what's the balance of power? What kind of technology is available? Who's where, what's what? Which that's a whole different phase from drafting. The second level of research, which used to be much, much harder and is now pretty simple, is, excuse me, detail-based research. This sort of stuff like finding the specific exhibits, which there are, you find the proper text, there are a whole bunch of guidebooks that are still around from the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. So at that level, once you find the reference, it's just a question of like going through it and looking through it. And I do, like, I was thinking about this in reference to my first book, which takes place during the Second World War. There was one point at which I had to find out what the standard issue rations were in a Soviet soldier's World War II ration kit, this particular time and place. Firstly, probably I didn't have to be completely correct on that, but I'm an insane person, so I wanted to be.
It's good to be thorough.
I think so. But secondly, that information has been available since the Second World War. You have always been able, that's not classified information, you find that out. But in the 21st century, that takes 10 minutes of Googling tops. Whereas it used to take a day and a half in the library. So to a certain extent, that sort of detail work, that's what really catches me up in other people's historical writing, when there's like detail work that you didn't take the time to Google, because you can Google it. It's not
Google
hard.
everything.
Yeah. So it's really just a willingness to have that attention to detail. And I feel like if you're not willing to make that effort, then why should someone be willing to spend the time with your text?
Right. Yeah. Well, and it's all about going back to like writing the story and like doing it the correct way and like telling the full story and not rushing any of the other steps.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Yeah. I love it. So are you working on anything right now?
I'm always working on something or other. I will admit that I'm terribly superstitious about this sort of thing.
You don't have to tell.
I do not. I think I've grandfathered my wife into the circle of trust, so she knows sometimes. But my good friends don't know. Often my agent doesn't know until I throw something at her. So
well, it's all that like free writing, you have to sort of play with the story a little bit. It's kind of like, I don't believe in taking a story to my critique group until I've written it. Like, you can send them the first chapter, and if you don't have the idea down, they
They're gonna
can
mess
mess
it
up
up.
your idea. Yeah,
Absolutely,
like
absolutely. I
totally
think
unintentional, but
there's a real degree to which, I mean, look, the whole process is about choosing words for spongy ideas, right?
yeah,
And if you choose words before the ideas are fully in your mind, then you're committing to the words, and the words are going to impact the
yeah.
ideas. So you got to be careful about putting words on stuff before it's ready.
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes you have to put a lot of things into your story that just aren't there because you're trying to figure it out.
Absolutely.
We're
Yeah,
going on this
absolutely.
journey. Yeah.
I will say, like, my number one dictum when I teach is all good writing is rewriting.
Yeah.
Getting it down is the first and most indispensable step, but nothing is ever done after a first draft. The real good work comes when you clarify things, when you increase things, when you decrease things, when you mess around in the
Yeah.
sandbox that you built.
Yeah. That's like where our strong suit is. We are all about editing. And like
Mhm.
I love to cut. Like it's my favorite thing.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. I
My
always
line
say
on
this.
that is follow your self-loathing, right? If you are reading any, 3-word phrase and you find yourself bored, get rid of it, because
Get
everyone
rid
else is going
of
to be
it.
bored too.
100%. You're like,
Yeah.
what is wrong with this chapter? It is dragging. Like, what can we do to make
Cut,
it better?
cut.
Exactly. I don't know. I read a lot of those fantasy novels. I'm like, who is their editor? Who is letting them get away
I
with this?
know, I know. It's something that really, I mean, it's weird and hard too, because of the particular cultural historical moment that we're in. People want propulsive narrative. They want lean narrative. People don't want a lot of extra research, a lot of extra world building. And yet there seems to be a faction of people who will dive into what feels to me like deeply irrelevant minutia, particularly in fantasy world building, where I just like it seems like we're running two different races at the same time. I don't know.
Yeah, like
I get
you're
it.
on this mission. All of a sudden, you're spending 2 days at a bar, like singing this song with these people, and you're like, what are we doing? Get back
Yeah,
on
I thought they were chasing you, like, yeah.
the exactly.
For sure.
Well, one last question, because I always like to have a fun one at the end. And we're both from the Midwest. You lived in Illinois, you live in Missouri now. Come see the fair. Yes, come see the fair. It takes place in Illinois, Chicago.
Mhm.
So what's something like fun or unexpected about the Midwest that people would be surprised to learn?
So I am a born and bred Midwesterner. I grew up in Michigan. My father's side of the family came from Chicago, most recently. My mother's side of the family is from Iowa. I currently live in St. Louis, so like deep, deep Midwest
You're
over here.
super Midwest, yeah.
Um, and what everyone's tempted to talk about is the nice and kind dichotomy, which I get it. I spent a fair amount of time in New York, and I have sort of the perspective on the differences there. For me, to begin with, I think the notion of the Midwest as a unified region is ridiculous. Like
Agree.
anything that encompasses Michigan and Nebraska at the same time, like that's not one culture, that's not one region. I don't know what we're doing here. And
No.
like also like the name your first warning that this thing is wrong, because like I guess it's mid in in the sense that it's like
In the
sort of
middle.
central in the country. There's nothing west about it. It's very much on the eastern half of the country.
Yeah.
um
Depending on where you draw the Midwest line, are you throwing in Ohio? Are you not?
yeah, for sure. The thing that's interesting to me about the Midwest, though, is that particularly in this country, because on the scale of history, there's
Mhm.
been, I should say this properly, white people have been building structures here for relatively little time, and those are most of the structures that are still around.
Yeah.
Obviously, indigenous populations have been building in North America for quite some time, and most of those structures are not around anymore. But many of the structures that are still around in the Midwest are very much products of the 19th century.
Mhm.
And there's this interesting experience of driving, most likely, or sometimes taking the train around the Midwest, which is like a kind of time travel, because particularly on trains, actually, you roll up to the train station and it's almost always this beautiful brick edifice that comes very much out of the age of rail. And even the way that settlements are deposited around the Midwest is very much like rail based.
Yeah.
And it's just so interesting how our contemporary lives in these regions is very much determined in their pattern by these architectural edifices. I'm not just talking about train stations, but the layouts of towns, how far towns are from one another, how far
Yeah.
towns are from rivers, based on 19th century technology, essentially. That's why we live our lives this way in the Midwest, rather.
Yeah.
And you get that super hard in Chicago, which like still is a fundamentally 19th century city, despite all of the incredible 20th and 21st century building. Like if you walk around, like River North or certainly the Gold Coast, these architectural details, deeply 19th century. It's super easy to just like let yourself wander off into a little bit of a time travel
Yeah.
spiral, which I do all the time. So I guess what I'm saying is, if you spend any time in the Midwest, do your best to try and snag your brain on a little bit of architectural time travel here or there.
Yeah. Yeah. And read, come see the fair first, and then go to
For sure.
Chicago and go to the pyramids, because most of the structures are probably still around.
That's right. And one way or another.
Yeah. Well, this has been so fun. And thank you so much
Yeah,
for doing this and spending time with us.
of course. My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, for sure. So where should they go to find out more about you and to obviously read your book? Everywhere, but
Yeah. I like to send people to their local independent bookstore if they can. If they've got the book in stock, you can buy it right there. And if not, they'll be happy to order it for you. You can also order online at bookshop.org is a great resource. My website is gavrielsavit.com. And I have a little bit of an extra there. The first thing I do whenever I set out to write a new project is I put together a project playlist that I listen to all throughout the writing of the book. Helps me to get into the right mindset. And those playlists are on my website. So if you pick up Come See the Fair or The Way Back or On the Swell Man, you want to hear what I was hearing while I was coming up with these stories, you can do that at gavrielsavit.com.
I love it. That's so fun. Can you listen to it on Spotify?
Yeah, they're all Spotify playlists.
Perfect. That sounds
Yeah.
great. Well, thanks so much.
Thank you.